Welcome to Friendly Math 101. Today our lesson is over the basic vocabulary terms that are associated with quadratic functions. Let's take a look at our first example. All quadratic functions are U-shaped graphs, and that U-shaped graph is called a parabola. So you will hear this word a lot when you're talking about quadratics because all quadratics are U-shaped. They're not V-shaped, they're slightly curved at the bottom. And this point right here is called the vertex. This is either going to be the highest point on your graph or the lowest point on your graph. And this point happens to be at 3, -2. Since this is a low point on our graph, we would also call it a minimum value, or we often call it a min. Another important vocabulary term is the term that describes the imaginary line that cuts through the middle of the parabola. This line divides your parabola into two equal parts, and what it's called is the axis or the line of symmetry. The axis of symmetry is not a point, however, it's a line, so we write it like an equation of a line. So this one happens to be x equals 3 because it describes that line that cuts through the middle of your parabola. And you'll notice that it always cuts through the vertex, that's why it has that same number there, that 3. Another important part of our parabola is where it crosses the x-axis, and we call those our x-intercepts. But they also have other names. We sometimes call them roots, zeros, or solutions. And the reason they have different names is because we use them in different contexts, but they're all describing where your parabola crosses the x-axis. So these happen to be at 2, 0 and 4, 0. Let's take a look at another example. So looking at this parabola, let's first identify our vertex, which is the highest point on this graph. And this vertex happens to be at the point -3, 1. Since it is a high point on our graph, we would call this a maximum, or we could call it a max for short. Again, that imaginary line that cuts through the middle of our parabola, dividing it into two equal parts, is called the axis of symmetry. A common misconception is that a lot of students think that the axis of symmetry is a number, but it's the equation of the line, and so this is x equals -3. And remember, the axis of symmetry always cuts through the vertex, and so that's why those x values are the same. And let's talk about these parts, or these points right here. These are the x-intercepts, where our graph crosses the x-axis. And again, some terms that mean the same thing. We sometimes call them roots, zeros, or solutions. And these happen to be at -2, 0 and -4, 0. Sometimes we write them as coordinate points, and sometimes we write them as x equals -2, x equals -4. Usually we write them like that when we're describing the solutions of an equation. That concludes our lesson on the basic vocabulary terms associated with quadratic functions. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave those questions in the comment section below. And for more math tutorials, subscribe to our channel, Friendly Math 101.